The courtroom held its breath, the air so heavy it seemed to press down on every shoulder in the room. At the center stood a man who once carried strength in his frame, but time had carved it away. 71 years old, his back bent, wrists bound by cold steel, eyes dulled by months of fear. Once he had walked with pride, now he trembled under the weight of judgment. The murmurs around him whispered one verdict before the gavel even fell. He's guilty. They didn't see a man, they saw a headline, a cautionary tale of disgrace. And yet, beneath that frail shell, there still lived the memory of who he had been, of what he had given when the world wasn't watching. The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, a single strike away from ending the story of his freedom. For the old man, every heartbeat felt like the sound of a door slamming shut, one after another, until nothing would be left but silence. And then, as if the air itself cracked open, a voice cut through the murmur. Firm, unshaken, it rose from the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, I request permission to address the court. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, questions formed. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped forward, briefcase in hand, his presence commanding immediate attention. I am Daniel Miller, attorney at law. I have crucial evidence that will exonerate this man. Behind him, a woman with kind eyes but steely resolve moved to his side. And I am Grace Miller, licensed social worker. We are here because the man you're about to condemn is the very reason we are alive today. In that moment, the old man lifted his weary eyes, and for the first time in months, a fragile spark flickered within them. It was not hope yet, but it was the question every soul in that room suddenly shared: what truth had been hidden all along? 12 years earlier, Robert Hayes was a man of 59 who carried the quiet weight of solitude. His days were simple, marked by long walks home and the silence that greeted him at the door. Winter pressed hard against the town that year, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones. And on one such night, as snow crunched under his worn shoes, he noticed 2 small figures curled near a dumpster. A boy barely 11 and his younger sister, no more than 8, clung together for warmth. Their faces were hollow with hunger, their clothes thin against the freezing wind. People passed by with quickened steps, pretending not to see, because seeing meant caring, and caring often demanded too much. Robert stopped. He didn't see trouble the way others did. He saw children who deserved more than concrete for a bed. Kneeling down, he spoke softly, offering them the kind of kindness that had been absent from their lives. When he brought them home, it wasn't charity, it was instinct, the refusal to let innocence be swallowed by neglect. That night, he laid out food, wrapped them in blankets, and promised they would not be alone again. What began as shelter grew into something deeper. Robert became their guardian, guiding them through school, reminding them of discipline and dignity, shielding them from the ridicule of classmates who mocked their past. They weren't bound by blood, yet he gave them the love of a father. Daniel showed a sharp mind for logic and debate, while Grace possessed a natural empathy that drew people to her. Robert nurtured both gifts, spending his modest savings on books, tutoring, and whatever they needed to succeed. Education is the one thing no one can take from you, he would tell them over dinner, watching their faces light up with understanding. He pushed them gently but firmly. Homework before television, library visits on weekends, encouragement to dream beyond their circumstances. For 6 years, his small apartment became a haven where 2 discarded children learned they had worth. The sacrifice came when Daniel was 17 and Grace 15. Robert's factory job had been eliminated. his savings depleted by years of supporting 3 people on one income. The bills piled up, the rent notices grew more urgent, and Robert's pride couldn't hide the truth any longer. He sat at their kitchen table one evening, his weathered hands folded, trying to find words for an impossible conversation. Daniel, sharp as always, spoke first. "You're struggling because of us, aren't you?" Robert started to deny it, but Grace's tear-filled eyes stopped him. These weren't children anymore. They were young adults who understood sacrifice because he had taught them about honor. "I've been researching," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the emotion. "The government has launched a new program, full support for academically gifted teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds. Housing, education, everything. Grace and we've been talking." Grace nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "We want to apply. Not because we want to leave you, but because we can't watch you sacrifice any more for us." The conversation that followed was the hardest of Robert's life. He wanted to fight their decision, to find another way. But their test scores were exceptional, their essays heartbreaking and brilliant. The program would give them opportunities he could never provide: prestigious schools, university preparation, a future without limits. 3 months later, on a rainy morning, Robert stood on his doorstep watching the government van pull away with the 2 most precious things in his life. Daniel and Grace pressed their faces to the rear window, tears streaming, hands pressed against the glass. Robert waved until the van disappeared, then walked back into his suddenly empty apartment and wept. They wrote letters at first, Daniel from his preparatory academy, Grace from her specialized school. But as their worlds expanded and Robert's contracted, the correspondence slowed. He moved to a smaller apartment, then a tiny room, as his finances continued to spiral. The letters found their way to old addresses, returned unopened. Phone numbers changed. Life, as it does, moved on. 8 years passed. Daniel earned a full scholarship to Oxford University, studying international law. Grace received a similar opportunity at the University of Toronto, focusing on social work and child advocacy. They excelled, driven by memories of a man who had believed in them when no one else would. They graduated with honors, returned to their home country, and began building careers they hoped would make Robert proud if he could see them. Daniel joined a prestigious law firm, taking on cases that mattered, often pro bono work for those who couldn't afford justice. Grace worked with at-risk youth, seeing Robert's face in every child she helped. They had tried to find him over the years, but their searches led nowhere. Robert Hayes seemed to have vanished from public records, leaving them with only gratitude and the determination to honor his memory through their work. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in Daniel's downtown law office. He was reviewing case files when a familiar name caught his eye in a brief his colleague had left on his desk. The State versus Robert Hayes, Fraud and Forgery. Daniel's coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. His hands shook as he read the details. Robert Hayes, 71, accused of falsifying land documents, forging signatures, stealing property from a neighbor. The case was set for trial in 2 days, and the defendant was representing himself with only a court-appointed lawyer who had already filed motions suggesting his client should consider a plea bargain. Daniel's first call was to Grace. She answered on the second ring. "Grace, I found him. I found Robert." The silence stretched before she whispered, Is he okay?" "No, he's in terrible trouble, and we're the only ones who can help him." The investigation that followed was swift but thorough. Daniel used every resource at his disposal: private investigators, document analysts, public records searches. What he discovered made his blood boil. The neighbor, Harold Vance, had a history of property disputes going back decades. He had filed similar accusations against 3 other elderly residents, always targeting those without family or resources to fight back. The documents allegedly forged by Robert showed clear signs of digital manipulation, something that would have been impossible for a man of Robert's generation and circumstances to accomplish. The signatures, when analyzed by experts, showed pressure patterns and pen strokes inconsistent with Robert's arthritis-affected hands. Meanwhile, Grace had located Robert's current address, a single room in a boarding house on the outskirts of town. They had gone there the night before the trial, but Robert was already being held in county lockup, unable to make bail. The room was sparse, nearly empty, but on a small table sat a folder containing newspaper clippings about Daniel's legal victories and Grace's community work. He had been following their careers from afar, proud and silent. In the courtroom, the prosecution was confident. Harold Vance sat in the front row, a well-dressed man with cold eyes, nodding as the prosecutor outlined the clear-cut case of elderly fraud. Robert's court-appointed attorney seemed resigned to defeat, shuffling papers without conviction. The judge was calling for final arguments when Daniel stood. "Your Honor, I am Daniel Miller, attorney at law, and I move for permission to present new evidence in this case." The prosecutor objected immediately, but Daniel was prepared. "This evidence directly contradicts the prosecution's central claims and proves the defendant's innocence. Justice demands it be heard." As the judge considered, Grace stepped forward. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years advocating for the voiceless. "Your Honor, I am Grace Miller, a licensed social worker, and I can testify to this man's character under oath." The judge, intrigued by this unexpected development, granted permission. Daniel approached the bench with a thick folder of evidence: forensic analysis of the documents, expert testimony on digital manipulation, Harold Vance's history of false accusations, and financial records showing Vance's motivation for acquiring Robert's small plot of land. But it was Grace who delivered the most powerful testimony. She stood before the court and told their story: 2 homeless children saved by a man who had nothing to gain and everything to give. She spoke of his sacrifices, his lessons about integrity and education, his gentle guidance that had shaped them into who they had become. "This man taught us that character is what you do when no one is watching," Grace said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "He watched over us for 6 years, asking nothing in return. He sacrificed his financial security to give us opportunities for education. He let us go when staying would have meant holding us back. This is not a man who would steal or deceive. This is a man who would give his last dollar to help a stranger." Daniel then methodically dismantled the prosecution's case. Each piece of alleged evidence was revealed as fabrication or manipulation. Harold Vance's pattern of targeting vulnerable, elderly residents was exposed. The financial motive, Vance's desire to acquire Robert's land for a development project, became clear. The judge's decision was swift. "In my 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a clear case of malicious prosecution. The evidence presented by Mr. Miller is overwhelming and indisputable. Not only is Mr. Hayes innocent of all charges, but it appears he has been the victim of a calculated scheme to defraud him of his property." The gavel fell with finality. "All charges dismissed. Mr. Vance, you will be investigated for perjury and filing false reports." The courtroom erupted, but Robert heard none of it. His legs gave way as Daniel and Grace caught him, the three of them holding each other as tears flowed freely. The man who had once carried them from the streets was now supported by their strength, their success, their unending gratitude. In the months that followed, Harold Vance was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Robert's property was secured, and a small settlement from the county helped restore some of what he had lost. But the true restoration was deeper than money. Daniel helped Robert find a comfortable apartment near both their homes. Grace visited every Sunday, bringing grandchildren that Robert had never expected to know. Her own children, who called him Grandpa, and climbed on his lap to hear stories. Daniel consulted with Robert on cases involving elderly clients, valuing his perspective and life wisdom. The media coverage of the trial had sparked something larger. Robert's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of human kindness. Speaking requests poured in, but Robert preferred quieter recognition. Letters from parents thanking him for inspiring their children. Visits from social workers who had read about his story. Small acts of kindness from strangers who understood his message. On quiet evenings, when Daniel and Grace would visit, Robert would sometimes look at them, successful, compassionate, strong, and marvel at the journey. 2 frightened children found in the snow had become his salvation in return. The kindness he had offered without thought of reward had circled back to him when he needed it most. "I always wondered," Grace said one evening as they sat on Robert's small balcony watching the sunset, "if we would ever be able to repay you for what you gave us." Robert smiled, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. "You already did, child. You already did. You became everything I hoped you could be. And when I needed it most, you remembered an old man who once believed in you." Daniel squeezed his shoulder gently. "We never forgot, Robert, and we never will." The evening breeze carried their laughter across the neighborhood, a sound of family reunited, of love that had endured separation and time, of kindness that had planted seeds years ago and finally come to harvest. In a world that often seemed to have forgotten compassion, their story served as a reminder. One act of kindness can echo through generations, and sometimes, if we are very fortunate, those echoes come back to us just when we need them most.